Guys, let's get on with module 14. We're going to talk about genes today. Okay, so there are researchers who specifically want to look at how do genes affect our behavior and our personalities. And these people we call behavior geneticists. And basically they look at the relative influence of our heredity versus our environment on our behavior. Now, let's break it down. In the nucleus of every cell, there are 46 chromosomes total, except for sperm and egg cells. They only have 23. So, chromosomes are thread-like structures that are made of DNA molecules that contain the genes. So, if we're going from largest to smallest, we've got chromosomes, then DNA, then genes. So, on our chromosomes are segments called genes. And these are basically segments of DNA that tell the body what to do via protein instructions. Okay. So in the human cell, there are about 20,000 genes. We have 20,000 genes total in our DNA. And not all of these are going to be active. Some of these will be active, some of them will be inactive. Now, there will be environmental events that can turn a gene on. So, let's say, for example, a person has a gene encoded for schizophrenia. Well, the schizophrenia gene might not be on until some kind of event triggers it to turn on, then producing the effects of schizophrenia. Now, humans in general, we share very, very similar genetic makeup. You and any other human are much more similar than you are different in your genetic coding. However, even small differences can make a big impact. So, for example, we have 96% of the same DNA as chimpanzees. That's really high. However, we're quite different than chimpanzees in a lot of ways. And so those small differences matter. Now, one thing to note, there is no single smart gene or no single fat gene or schizophrenia gene. There's no single gene for most things. Most things are made up of various genes, teams of genes that kind of contribute to an overall effect. Okay, so in genetics, in this question of nature nurture, we use twin and adoption studies to help us answer some questions. So first, let's differentiate between the two types of twins. Identical twins are called monozygotic twins. These are twins that were formed because one fertilized egg cell actually just happened to split, just divided on itself and cloned itself, which isn't supposed to happen. It just kind of did this. And so it basically cloned oneself. And these twins have 99% of the same DNA. Now, identical twins can only be of the same sex. They can only be male and male or female and female. A couple of things that can make some differences in identical twins. Though that they have all of the same genes, the number of the copies of genes that each twin has could be different. So for example, let's say two twins inherit the gene for schizophrenia, and one identical twin develops it and the other doesn't. The reason for this is because the person who developed it, the twin that developed it, could have had more copies of that gene than the twin that didn't. They both have it, but this one has more of it. Also, sometimes the twins can have two different placentas, and that can lead to one baby getting more nutrition, better nutrition than the other. And that can also lead to changes in the twins. So that's identical or monozygotic. Fraternal are what we call dizygotic twins. And these are two fertilized egg cells that got fertilized by two separate sperm. So basically, they're just like any two siblings. It could be brother and sister, or sister, brother, brother. They are no genetically similar than any two other siblings. What makes them unique, though, is that they share the same environment, the same prenatal womb environment. They call them womb mates. And so that can contribute to some similarities in behaviors, more so than just two regular siblings. So the thing is about when people have the same genes, sometimes this can lead to the same experiences. And researchers have studied 15 million twins to understand the effects of genes on behavior and diseases. So, what the research has shown us is that identical twins' personalities are more similar than fraternal twins. This then indicates that personality is partially genetic, because if it wasn't, then there shouldn't be any difference between the two. Even when identical twins have been treated differently by their parents, like this twin was treated differently than this twin, they actually are about the same in personality than twins who were treated the same by their parents. So again, this tells us that the environment isn't really affecting personality. Genetics are really big in affecting personality. Now, there was a researcher, Bouchard. They located and studied 74 pairs of identical twins who were raised apart. Okay, so these are twins that were separated at birth for whatever reason. What they found was that they had similarities in their tastes, their physical attributes, but also in their personalities. There's an example of the Jim twins, and they connected in, I believe, their 50s. And the similarities between these two men were amazing. So the gist of it is that our personality is very genetic. Now, overall, identical twins raised apart are more similar in personality than fraternal twins. So this tells us again that identical twins are kind of demonstrating that our genes have a big impact on who we are. And in fact, these are my little sisters who are identical twins. Another way that we can study kind of the effects of genes versus environment is through adoption studies. So interestingly, you might think, where you grow up affects your personality. But what researchers have found pretty much completely disregards that. So what we have found is that when a child is adopted, they're actually far more similar in personality to their biological parents than their adoptive parents. Where you grow up doesn't really have an effect on your personality. However, that doesn't mean adoptive parents don't have any influence on their adopted children. They do. They can influence their attitudes, their values, their manners, their politics, and their faith beliefs. But their core personality is not being affected. There was an example in the textbook that talked about these twins. One was adopted by a Jewish family during World War II, and one was adopted by a German family who actually this child went into the Nazi youth program. And, that clearly affected them a lot. Now, their personalities were very similar. However, because of their backgrounds, they had very different worldviews. Now, there are positive aspects to adoption. We find that when babies are adopted, or oftentimes they have better life outcomes psychologically with intelligence scores than if a mother considered adoption but went against it. Now, again, that's correlational data. That's not experimental. So there's probably lots of confounding variables, but that's what the research shows us, that there is a correlation between adoption and positive life outcomes. Okay, now heritability. Heritability is a funky idea, but basically, when we're talking about heritability, what we mean is that heritability is the proportion of variation among individuals in a group that we can attribute to genes. So basically, if something has a high heritability, it means that genes can explain most of the variation in that population. So let's say, for example, intelligence has a heritability of 66%. Okay. What that tells us is that 66% of cases in that population, the variation in intelligence can be due to genetics. So genetics are having an impact on intelligence. Height is something that is very heritable, meaning it can explain a lot of the differences in our genetics can explain a lot of differences in our height. That doesn't mean that height is purely genetic, because it's not. For example, when we compare South Koreans and North Koreans, who are very similar genetically, South Koreans tend to be 6 inches taller than North Koreans because they have better nutrition, because they're not in a oppressive dictatorship. Now, so basically, if something has high heritability, it means that genes play a role and can explain most of the variation in that population. If something has low heritability, it means that genes cannot account for the variation in that. And so the differences among people must be due to the environment. So if we were to have a perfect example, if everyone had the same genes, yet they had different levels of outgoingness, which we call extroversion. If everyone had the same genes, but they had different levels of extroversion, then extroversion in that case would be low for heritability, because it couldn't be due to the genes. It would be due to the environment. Okay, now, gene and environment interaction. So there are some more subfields that kind of look at how do our genes and our environment interact. So one is molecular genetics, and this subfield studies the molecular structure and function of genes. And they want to understand, how do our genes interact with our environment? So one goal is to find some of the genes that together orchestrate complex traits such as body weight, sexual orientation, and impulsivity. They just basically want to know what genes are working together to kind of create who we are. Then we have epigenetics. So epigenetics study the mechanisms by which environments can trigger or block genetic expression. So one thing to know is that genes are self-regulating and react to the environment. So there are these African butterflies, and in the summer, they are green. But in the fall, the temperature actually acts as a trigger to the gene to change the proteins being made, and it changes the color of the butterfly into brown. So they're self-regulating and they're reactive. Now, also, our experiences can create epigenetic marks, which are basically methyl molecules that are attached to a part of a DNA strand. If the mark tells the cell to ignore any gene present in that DNA segment, those genes will be turned off, and they will prevent the DNA from producing the proteins. So diet, drugs, and stress, these can all influence the epigenetic molecules that regulate gene expression. They can turn things on and they can turn things off. Now, here's what's crazy. They have found that epigenetic marks can be passed down through generations. For example, they studied rats, and they taught these rats to fear the smell of orange blossoms. Okay. That caused an epigenetic mark in these rats. And what actually happened is, once those rats had babies, though those baby rats were never exposed to that specific experience, when stimulated with the orange blossoms, the baby rats also responded in fear, meaning that they had literally inherited that behavior from their parent, which they learned. We also find this in case studies of trauma survivors. So Holocaust survivors and their descendants have very similar genomes, and also demonstrate some of these epigenetic marks. All right, and now you're going to test yourself. See ya.